I say good morning, everybody. Welcome to this week's Social Housing Roundtable. My name is Matthew Baird. I've been working in social housing recruitment now for 11 years. I was just having a couple of technical issues this morning, so apologies for one or two of those. But it was my recruitment company basically has funded the Social Housing Roundtable. There's something which we found during the first lockdown, as I briefly mentioned before we started recording. The idea is just to bring everyone together to discuss a different topic every week, because the more voices we can get in the social housing world, sharing ideas, sharing best practice, the better it is for everybody. And it's nice to see some familiar faces and some new ones. I'd say my background is recruitment. That's what I've done. That's what my business is. So if anybody is looking to hire in any way, shape or form, from kind of executive and kind of mid-management, then please give me a shout. This week, I was introduced to both Dewbien and Ed by, I think Ed, you came onto a previous roundtable, I believe, actually. And the team from Capita said, well, there's so much going on with regulation and things like that at the moment. It'd be great to come on and be able to have a conversation and highlight how we can demystify some of the issues, but also build those relationships. So Ed, I appreciate you kind of stepped in at the very much last minute here. So I'll pass over to you to kind of introduce yourself and start things. I'll see what I can do in the background to help anything I can on the technical side.
Lovely. Yeah, thanks ever so much, Matt, and good to meet everybody and see everyone in the room. So yeah, so my name's Edward Crouch, and I should hopefully be joined very shortly by Dewbien Plummer. We're from Capita. Dewbien's our solutions lead, and I'm business development director for housing. Many of you may or may not know what Capita are about, but we're a large organisation with employees all around the world, but primarily here in the UK. We see ourselves as agents of change when it comes to social housing and the public sector more generally. We do a lot of stuff that people don't know about. So we manage the smart metering network. We look after gas safe, ULEZ, TV licensing. And so our mantra is creating better outcomes. So what we try and do is do that through software, through services, through people, and through solutions. My background is in social housing, so I worked in operations for a registered provider. I then worked for a local authority, and I've been on the board of a registered provider locally. So housing's been in my blood pretty much all of my career, and now working for Capita to help them, with their sort of products and services to help the sector. And I think it's fair to say that the sector has been under a huge amount of scrutiny. There have been, a number of issues that have brought the sector to the attention of the media, not necessarily in the way that we would like, but certainly I think there's a huge amount of talent and goodwill in the sector. And and I think it's the moment is ripe for change. So the first point we've got here is how prepared organisations are for change in. Sorry, Dewbien is having a bit of trouble there. So how prepared do you feel for change in your organisation? I think this would be really interesting. I don't know, Matt, if it's possible to do a poll or just a sort of a comment in the chat on a scale of sort of 1 to 10, with 10 being absolute experts and we've got it completely nailed, and 1 being what is regulation. I'd be really interested to sort of see where people feel they are on that spectrum, because what we see
Give me 30 seconds, I'll get the poll set up.
Excellent. Thank you. And yeah, because I think it's fair to say that that the subject area is broad, and organisations have different levels of maturity, is what we find. So I'm relying on Matt here for a little poll, but it'd be really great to have your insight on this.
No worries, nothing like a last minute.
Sorry. We can do 1 to 5 if that's easier than 1 to 10. Excellent.
There we are.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Matt.
No, absolutely fine.
I should also mention this is Chatham House rules. If people are feeling in the lower end of the spectrum, we certainly won't be telling anybody. But
and it's completely confidential. Nobody can see what people are voting anyway, so obviously that helps. Looks like, yeah, we're getting a kind of 7 to 9 there as the main thing. a few with 4 to 6. So yeah, no one at 10. We've got a 1 to 3 in there. Thank you for everyone being honest. I think that's the most important thing. It's as ever. I think somebody put on there. There we go. Anna put in the chat there. I think we know what's coming in high-level requirements, but less sure on the detail. And I don't know if that speaks probably to kind of what's going on and your thoughts as well at the moment, which is that people kind of have an idea of the overview, but less on the specifics.
Yeah. And I think that's really interesting, because I think that highlights the conversations I know that Dewbien's been having, more widely in the sector. I should have mentioned Dewbien is a sector colleague as well, with 20 years plus experience, and she's been working in operations up until very recently. And I think what's been demonstrated in the poll there is pretty much the same across the board, and we're having conversations with housing providers across the country, from sort of smaller, local providers through to the G15. I think there is a sort of a real spectrum of confidence in terms of the upcoming regulation. So I think this is just of the overall aims in terms of the overview of the changes. Some questions on some discussion points we're going to go through, and what the changes might mean for your organisation. As I said at the beginning, I think it's fair to say there's an awful lot going on, and I think that certainly in my career in social housing, this is I think it's fair to say that there's been as much news on social housing in the last 12 months than there has previously in the previous decade or more. It's been very busy from a media point of view. So in terms of the defining moment, I think it's fair to say that Grenfell was a significant turning point for social housing regulation, and you can see here the quote regarding a defining moment. Certainly from Dewbien's experience, her calling was to social housing following the Grenfell tragedy, and certainly her views and the work she's been doing has been formed by that. And out of the Grenfell tragedy, there have been two key pieces of legislation and reviews. So you've got the Grenfell Tower inquiry and the Hackett review, which was designed to look at the impact, and then how the safety of the building and how landlords impacted the Grenfell tragedy. And then I think this is a sort of a high level in terms of the case for reform, so what the finding of those reviews were. So and these issues, these may chime with providers in terms of again the spectrum of issues that can be affected in terms of poor record keeping and data management, some of the issues around indifference towards residents, a lack of professional training, competence, skills, and a lack of transparency and accountability of landlords. And I think it's really odd because speaking from a personal point of view, working with colleagues in the sector, there is a huge amount of, like I said, talent and goodwill. But I think sometimes things like, data management, things like, record keeping, and some of the cultural issues that I think were highlighted through those reviews, I think have played into the anxieties of residents not being listened to, and the sort of a culture of not necessarily taking certain issues from certain corners of the resident group seriously. It's just a high level timeline of where we've come from since 2017, and you can see the two most recent sort of developments in terms of the social housing white paper, and more recently the Awab Ishaq tragedy, which I think has brought condensation, damp and mold to the forefront of providers' minds. And many of you will be aware of social media activism in this, and it's really interesting seeing Kwajo and Michael Gove sort of arm in arm on this, and it's a really odd. It doesn't seem quite right, to have the sector, to have an activist and the government sort of linking up on this. But I think it kind of demonstrates how seriously the government is taking this issue, and many of you will have seen the media campaign on condensation, mold and damp that's been quite hard hitting, and really been highlighting to residents their rights in relation to this. In regards to the social housing white paper, these were the 7 key proposals and findings in regards to what residents can expect. I don't think any of those are particularly shocking. I think they are Many of you, I'm sure, in your organizations will be doing this, or will have your own local policies and procedures and charters to demonstrate, the commitment to these to these core tenets. But I think certainly this is where the strategic direction that the government is expecting to take in relation to social housing reform. Certainly, the whole sector, I think, was rocked by this tragic case, and I think that it was a further defining moment. Grenfell highlighted the issues around fire safety and residents being listened to, and this case, I think I'm right in saying, the first time when where a coroner had directly attributed the death of an infant, in this case, to the building condition. And you can see on the right-hand side there the significant impact that had on the provider. So obviously, the tragic impact on the family, but in terms of reputation, in terms of the board, in terms of the funding for that provider and the grading, it's really significant. And not that it needs to be said, but the reputational impact of not managing not managing stock and not managing the repairs and the resident involvement clearly has had a significant impact, and the wider impact to that is on the further residents. So the loss of the £1 million affordable home grant, that's not going to affect the chief exec and the board's take-home pay. It will affect their ability to deliver units, and I think at the end of the day, that is what social housing providers are there to do, to look after their existing residents, to grow their stock so that they can provide safe, warm homes for more people. That's what it's all about, and that's what I know the sector is here to do. And I think this is just sort of talk about showing graphically how those two pieces of those two inquiries have led through. So Grenfell inquiry, social housing regulation bill, and then the Hackett review into the Building Safety Act. So this highlights, this is as of December last year. So the Social Housing Regulation Bill and the Building Safety Act are working their way through the legislative system. The regulator, certainly, colleagues may have seen this as well, but the regulator has been far more, I think has the strength of the regulator has been growing. And I think certainly I've seen the Housing Ombudsman and the regulator speak, and there is a sort of a renewed sense of strength in both of those organizations, because I think they recognize that in terms of standards, in terms of upholding those principles that the government have set out, they hold a really key part in that. And I think where it also touches on where also you've got the tenant satisfaction measures, and I think the other one which has become particularly pressing and urgent is in relation to energy efficiency and in relation to building condition, and I think the impact from the increase in energy prices has kind of compounded some of this with energy prices being so high. It puts further pressure on residents to make that difficult decision between paying the rent, putting the heating on, putting food on the table. So it is a bit of a perfect storm, I think, in that respect.
Welcome back, Dewbien.
Welcome back, Dewbien. So,
hello, everybody.
This might be a good moment for me to pause and to apologise for anyone who's been expecting a far more polished presentation that's had me wittering on for the last 15 minutes. Dewbien, I've made my way through the majority of the slides, and we're just, not the majority, we've done slides 1 to 12, and we're now just at number 13, which is the first question slide. So I think people would be bored of me, so I might just pause there, and if you wanted to just jump in and maybe just introduce yourself, and we can maybe carry on through the slides.
Thank you, everybody, for your patience. Big apologies. Just as we were about to start the session, there was a leak in the server and there's an internet blackout, so apologies. My name is Dewbien Plummer. I'm the Housing Solutions Director working alongside Ed for Capita. And my background is in social housing, so I've been in the sector for over 20 years, half and half housing associations and local authority, and focusing in the last sort of 5 years or so on digital transformation and housing strategy. And I've got a very, my whole kind of connection with the sector changed after Grenfell. And I know that we've talked a bit about the impact of Grenfell and how that relates to regulation. And so that's a particular area of interest for me. And I guess just sort of feeding into what we've been talking about, what we are interested in is understanding how organisations are responding to the changes in legislation, whether there are things that you feel are going to be more or less challenging, and how prepared both you as individuals and your organisations feel for the upcoming changes.
We ran a little poll on that, Dewbien, and Matt very kindly put the results, but I think it was
amazing.
There was a bit of a spectrum of confidence, and I think that the main takeaway from that was that most folks, I think, are aware of the highlights and the core changes that are coming, but as with most things, the devil may be in the detail. So I think that's where I managed to get to with my deep knowledge of this subject, as you know.
Awesome.
So on the slide here, it says, what challenges do you think the sector will have meeting the new regulatory requirements, and how prepared do you feel your organisation is for the coming changes? Is there any points you kind of want, do you want this to be in the open discussion kind of and Q&A part here, Dewbien, or are there kind of any other points you'd like to raise based on, the highlights of the presentation so far?
So what we've done is kind of put questions throughout the presentation and the slides, because ultimately, it's about what does it mean for you and what are you doing? How does it impact you? How does it impact your work? How does it impact your organization? So they're questions to prompt colleagues on the call to be thinking about, but also you can put stuff in the chat, any quick questions or anything in the chat that we can come back to at the end of the slide.
We'd had a point made by Sarah Jackson, actually, which said, as well as being prepared for changes to legislation and regulation at an operational level, we need to ensure strong governance throughout is also an important consideration for boards of social housing providers. And that's backed up actually by Val Knight, who said she was at the Ombudsman panel meeting last night, and the next spotlight is knowledge and information of who is in homes. How much, I guess, interaction are you finding from, because I know this is having only just recently kind of come onto board and myself at the end of last year, how much engagement are there from kind of chair of the boards compared to, say, chief executives and directors of providers themselves?
So that would be interesting. It'd be interesting to hear from colleagues on the call. From my experience, the more senior executives are a little bit slower to get into the detail of things. So there's an awareness that there's change. There's an awareness on sort of a high level. But as the legislation starts to take shape and as things start to fall out of it, I think there's going to be a much more need for the boards and C-suites to engage meaningfully in what the change that's happening. But I'd be interested to hear from colleagues on the call whether they feel that there's kind of that focus all the way through the organisation, particularly at leadership level.
Would anybody like to come in, or does anybody have a question, or in terms of what challenges do you see as coming up? Would anyone like to put a question in the chat? If not, then we can. Val, over to you. Nice to have you with us.
Hi, yeah. What you were saying, we've got the chief exec on board, and the chairman as well, but it's the middle bit where the blockage is that holds up everything. So chief exec pass the message down and then it gets blocked. I think it's because there's either too many layers of managers in housing nowadays that it just gets lost. So the top will say something, and then by the time it gets down to the bottom, it's totally something different. Mm. And I think that's a challenge that quite a few of us are going to have to sort out.
Communication coming all the way through the chain.
Yeah.
Cool. Shall we, Ed, are you doing the slides? Are you?
I'll do the slides, yeah.
My lovely assistant. Thank you, Val. So I wanted to kind of talk about two of the main bits of legislation, just a couple of slides. So first one, Building Safety Act, and this is a huge groundbreaking piece of legislation and has been described as the giant of construction legislation because it has really wide-ranging reforms looking at all sorts of things. So looking at things like cladding and how you make things, requirements for safety. It's also looking at paying and who pays for things. So a big issue around leaseholders and them being held financially responsible for remedial works. There is a whole toolkit of measures available to make those accountable for the problems responsible. So, and what you find, and there's something called the veil. There's a cool term which I can't see because I can't see my notes. But the thing about the Building Safety Act is it starts to move beyond just the landlords and also looking at those construction companies and those organizations that contribute very significantly to some of the problems and the defects and the problems that we have. And so it's really kind of changing that dynamic that we've had up until this point, where the landlord just takes all the flack, you know, the building company dissolves after a few years and you're left kind of holding all the problems. And something else that's super interesting as well is the concept of a golden thread. And so we've talked about that a lot in the sector, you know, connecting the dots, you know, strategy to individuals, and they've brought this principle into to building safety, looking at the entire life cycle of the building. So from design all the way through to disposal. And this is a real kind of piece around data. What do we know about the buildings? And it's something that in the sector we've always kind of talked about. We need to know more, stock condition surveys, but now the law is changing. And so there's a requirement for organizations to know their buildings and know what's going on with them. Oh, sorry, I went to move it. Can you move it along, Ed? So, and this is what we need to, so these are the questions that colleagues and landlords need to be asking. What do we know about our buildings? So you've got what properties do we even have? Because, and those on the call will know that it's not a surprise for like blocks to pop up here and there, depending on the size of your organization. So what do we know about our buildings, their construction, the age, yada, yada. What do we know about the people that live in them? Another big issue for us as a sector. Who are our tenants? Who is the household? Who's there? What needs do they have? What are their requirements? And then bringing that information together, the relationship between the two. And that is really both the Building Safety Act and social housing regulation. It's about what do we know about our buildings, our properties, and what are we doing with that information to inform our services.
And I think on that point, I think it's fair to say that housing providers, you know, if you just look at your residents, you know, there are hundreds of lines of data in that person's record. Properties, you know, they're made up of hundreds and hundreds of assets. Again, all will have lines of data. And I think what we find in the conversations we have with providers is that they are often extremely data rich, but quite often insight poor. And, you know, I'm sure many colleagues around the table will recognize, you know, you'll be filling things in, you'll be having all this data, but when it comes down to what it actually gets used for, it might be used for a statistical return, or it might be used for a board report. But actually, is that information being used to keep people safe? Is that information being used to have predictive analytics that will highlight a problem? Like with your rent accounting, you know, there are systems, clever systems that do things with rent. So it'll tell you if something's looking off. The sector really needs to embrace and to look broadly, you know, beyond some of the narrow silos when it comes to data, because the amount of information you hold quite often is more than the health service, more than central gov, because you've got, you know, it's that cradle to grave. You know, you might have a 30-year relationship with your residents in their home, with their family, with their children, and I think, you know, that puts a huge onus, I think, moral obligation in terms of using the data you've got to you know, do good things with. And I think that nowadays, yeah, data rich and insight poor is something we see across the sector, and it is a problem because it's all that data could be put to good use. If it isn't, it's a missed opportunity.
There was a roundtable I ran last year with Claire Patterson of CP Data, who actually said, does social housing hold too much information? It's available on the YouTube channel. You can go back and see it. And a lot of that was actually discussed. And it's certainly an interesting debate. I think, you know, the question she always asks is, fine, you're asking the question, but what are you actually using it for? If you're just using it to find out information, that's no good. If you're genuinely going to use that data, then make sure it's something that, you know, by always ask it if you have a reason for it. a couple of points in the chat before we move on past this slide.
Yeah, let's please.
Val Knight had said landlords need to hold contractors to account when failing. And then back that up said housing providers, when they merge with another housing provider, lose the knowledge with who is in their homes. And I think merging is a real issue in the sector. I think there's a lot of demand, a lot of requirement for it to happen at the moment, but what happens with the data and who's actually responsible for it and accountable for it is a big issue. Are you seeing much in those merger side of things you've been at the moment?
I mean, housing, particularly housing estate, that's the flavor. And we had like a flurry of activity at one point. We're starting to, and we've got, you know, some happening now, but that is very much that has been certainly in the past a direction of travel for housing associations. And I think, Val, you've made a spectacular point. When housing providers come together in merge, yes, they're 1 million units strong, but do you have like 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different ways of working, different sets of data, different bits of information? And so certainly there's a piece of work that needs to be prioritized around aligning all of those different cultures and different ways of working and making sure that, you know, that's being done sort of, you know, appropriately. And we've seen
is it easier from a regulatory perspective to manage one large housing provider? Because obviously I know there was beginning of this news this week that Sovereign and Network are going to are in talks of merge, which they will be an 82,000 home landlord, which is just it's too big. That's my opinion. For me it's too big. But is it easier from a regulatory perspective to manage that as one entity rather than having multiple small businesses?
So I think if you've got one person to go to, it's always better. Managing it from a perspective and then the experience of the residents are 2 different things. And I guess, and this is not on any of the slides, but what I wanted to communicate to everybody on the call and to those working in social housing, it's very easy for us to think somebody else has to do something. So absolutely, there's a responsibility on the leadership within social housing to, you know, put structures in place, put things in place. But one of the things that I did want to communicate from somebody who's worked in social housing for decades is that every single person in the sector has the ability to contribute positively and has a responsibility and accountability. And many of us are never going to get into the rooms where we're discussing mergers and whether we should have 100,000 providers or not. But what all of us do in some way is engage with residents, we engage with our staff that we manage, we have to implement the things that we've been asked to do. And so I think that there are bigger considerations that are being discussed around structure and organization, but there's also the point of everybody seeing that it's their responsibility to grow, to improve, to understand their customers and see how they can contribute to that.
And I think that's where culture plays a massive part. And I mean, culture is a huge part of housing at the moment. And if you're in a business which embraces that mindset, then brilliant. If you're not, is where I know there have been struggles. There are a couple of things in the chat here. So Anna Henderson, there are difficult decisions to be made about viability of schemes. For example, does having 2 lifts as a standard mean the service charges become unaffordable? I guess finding the balance between those is obviously difficult. And then there's the point kind of going back to the data from Judith Ratcliffe. In relation to what do we know about our tenants, how granular is that getting? What safeguards are in place to prevent misuse of personal data and unexpected uses like analytics? There is a moral obligation to protect people's privacy as well as human rights law. Data minimization is key, and even some of that information shouldn't be statistics or board reports, arguably. Also, if there is a lot of data, perhaps some of it should be destroyed and not collected in the first instance. I think this is where a lot of issues around data come about. But then, as you say, you know, we go back to that. I guess it ties in with Anna Henderson's point there, saying, well, is 2 lift standard? Well, if we have the data that shows we don't need 2 lifts, is that then a viable option for it? Finding that balance, I imagine, is very difficult, and trying to advise on that from a regulatory perspective, I guess it's a constant challenge based on individual businesses, is it?
I think I'm gonna pass on to Ed in a sec, but I think this is a really great question, Judith, and I think this has been a challenge for those of us in the sector who have been asked. So, you know, I started out as a housing officer. Well, I didn't, but I've been a housing officer, and we've been asked, oh, go out, ask people their, you know, personal business, their sexual preferences, what have you. And it's like, okay, why? I don't really feel comfortable doing that. So there's some fundamental education around what data we're collecting, why we're collecting it, what we're using it for, and then very clear parameters around privacy. What is it we're doing? And I think, again, so one of the things that is come out of the legislation, which I'll touch on in the next couple of slides, is around training. But these are new considerations that we need to get our heads around and grapple with. Any successful organization providing services must base their decision-making on data. If you don't know who you're serving, you can't help them. And this particularly becomes relevant when we look at things like protected characteristics, very high levels. So say, for example, disability, which is quite a big one for housing. You could have the main tenant who isn't disabled, but if you don't have information around the household, then you're not necessarily going to be able to provide the best possible services. And it's about understanding what we're using the information for and having clear parameters around that. So it's a tricky subject, but one that we need to grapple with, because without that data, we're not helping our residents, and that's been very, very clear. And we're not just not helping our residents, people are actually dying. So there's, you know, we've got to get our head around where the boundary lines lie, but know that you cannot make good decisions if you don't have the information to support that.
I'll let you move on with the presentation, but there was Sue Weston. I wholeheartedly agree about the importance of one person for tenants to go to, especially in supported housing. It's real conversations with people may be more valuable than analytics, and that you've no need to ask for stuff like sexual preferences. I completely agree. And then the young man who's
interesting one. So can I stop you there? So this
unless it's a specific LGBT.
Yeah, that's a really good, you know, we could get stuck into that. Again, I just want to re-emphasize it's about why we want that information and what we're going to do with that information. But let's not get caught up.
No, I completely agree there. There are occasions, but you don't need to know it for every single tenant or resident that you've got. And as you said, the reasons behind. And then the young man who died, no one should live with black mold in their flat. No one needed to know his little boy. Want and need are two different things. The rule is necessary and proportionate. And I think that was it's the point often made by Lara Oyedele, is that you go to a board report and you're saying, well, 98% or 97% success with X, Y, and Z, and said that's fine. But what about that 2 or 3%? How bad is that 2 or 3%? How poor is the quality people are living in? Because that's the stuff we need to be focused on more than the 97.
Perfect. All right. So we're making good time. Right. So I'm going to touch on, I love this data we got stuck in. I'm going to touch on Social Housing Regulation Bill. I think a lot of us will be more familiar with this bill. This sets out to deliver the proposals based on the Social Housing White Paper, giving tenants greater powers, greater access to information, and swift and fair redress. So that is about how we respond to complaints, which is a huge issue for us. How we're engaging with our residents, how we're listening to our residents, giving them information on performance, that sort of stuff. If you could move on, Ed.
Yeah, 1 second. Here we go.
My lovely assistant. And then, yeah, so these are just some of the headlines. I think what's relevant for those of us on the ground, the scope of the regulator and the housing ombudsman have increased significantly. And that's important, because what that means is when we have situations around, you know, complaints or things going wrong, in the past, you might get a slap on the wrist, you know, a few £100 fine, whatever. Now people are losing their jobs. Now there's thousands, you know, there's not a cap on the fines. Now it's a completely different thing. Co-regulation, and what that is about. So you've got the housing ombudsman, you've got the regulator, there's also the expectation that providers are actively contributing to that kind of monitoring. So you and this may have happened in your own organization, but you're seeing a lot more providers self-referring to the regulator when they're looking at their services and saying, actually, we're not doing what we're supposed to be, which is what happened with the AWEB case, and that's, you know, they've self-referred themselves. Energy efficiency is embedded into the responsibilities for the regulator, and that's relevant because it ties in with repairs and maintenance and managing your properties. It's not just keeping the place warm. What does that mean for our net zero and our carbon neutral and our climate change objectives? So making sure that that's tied in always. Transparency, and this is actually quite a broad-reaching one. For housing associations who are not subject to the Freedom of Information Act, there will be a similar sort of requirement. So there's not going to be that same kind of distinction. And that also extends quite significantly and meaningfully into, say, for example, there's a kind of breach and you have to go to give account. There's now the expectation that whoever is giving account has the information they need. So in the past, people could say, oh, I didn't work here, and, you know, plead ignorance. That's not a thing anymore. So that has been really bedded in quite fine detail. And I think particularly for housing associations who haven't had that level of scrutiny, it's something to be mindful of. Monitoring powers, enforcement powers, they can turn up, they can inspect, they can force you to repair. There's all sorts of things. Tenant satisfaction measures, which I hope all colleagues will be familiar with because that kicks off April. Inspections are coming next year, so on and so forth. And I think the thing that's quite interesting is the professionalism standards, something extremely close to my heart, because you need your staff, everybody needs to have that, the skill set and the tools to be able to deliver what's being required. And I think in housing for years, there has been this perception that training is a luxury or a reward, as opposed to a necessary, essential part of ongoing staff development. And yeah, that's another question. Do colleagues see any challenges around the new training requirements? So the first thing they've announced is consultation for housing managers who have some sort of accreditation. And there's an estimate that will affect 25,000 people. It's still quite vague, but I'm interested if anyone's kind of caught wind of that or got any feelings on that one.
From conversations I've had, Anna, I'll bring you in 2 seconds, but the conversations I've had have been actually there's been a lot of either apathy or pushback from directors and chief execs who are going, this is just a waste of time. Like, and actually already kind of going, I'm already hearing this is just going to be a pain, they're going to have to be off, they're going to be doing this, that, the other. Yeah. Without looking at the benefits, they're immediately going, how's that going to affect day to day? And that's a really interesting balance. But Anna, I'll bring you in. Anna, you're on mute. First time
okay, let's try that again.
The bingo card has been ticked off.
Oh, there you go. Always me. I was just going to say, I was looking at the syllabus for the senior level apprenticeship, which is obviously the preferred vehicle for delivering this this qualification. And at the moment, they haven't even agreed on what will definitely be contained within that syllabus and who will be responsible for assessing it, and an awful lot of the administration that will go with it. And I just think realistically, in terms of the volume and the numbers of people that will need to get through that, it could be years before people have actually got to that stage. And I do think it's something that needs to be done in a managed way, but obviously people change roles as well within organisations and things. I think keeping track of it will become an industry in its own right.
I think there's also a concern over the content. I think people are actually kind of going, well, what's going to go into this? Is this who's creating what this new service? What is it going to be? The CIH model that's already in place? Is it going to be something new? And from other people I'm speaking with, there's, I guess, a concern, as very much as Anna's mentioned there, kind of going, well, are we training managers who aren't going to listen? Should we not be training anyone new coming into the business, but like I mean, I know some people don't like the term front line, but people know what I mean when I say it. Kind of, is it not better to train our, housing assistants, our apprentices, our officers in good practice, because they're more likely to correct the managers who are kind of going, well, no, we don't do it that way. That's not the way it's done anymore. Then a manager, how easy is it going to be then to disseminate that information? If, like I say, I mean, we've got potentially an 82,000 home landlord, I guarantee there aren't going to be 82 housing officers each with 1,000 packs. So how many housing officers are going to be? It's a concern. Anna.
And I think it doesn't take into account any other professional qualifications that people have. So speaking from my own experience, quite a few years ago, I was given the choice between doing a CMI course or a CIH course. And I picked to do the CMI course because I felt it was more transferable, but had an awful lot of still extremely relevant leadership, performance management, accountability type content in the syllabus. Yet that qualification that I hold wouldn't be deemed as recognised under the current proposals. So I think there does need to be a little bit of looking at sort of what other qualifications are out there that actually do contribute to the professionalism of the sector, not just the CIH ones.
I think I agree with you, Anne. I think that it's a bit like, international driving license, isn't it? If you can drive a car in the UK, you can probably drive a car in Australia, as long as you don't mind kangaroos jumping out in front of you. I think my personal view, and this may be controversial, is I think in 20 years' time, those of us who are still working in the sector or retired or whatever, I think we will look back and go, God, can you imagine doing this job without some kind of formal qualifications? Is my personal view. I think that, you look at how when I was a housing officer, it's 50%, marriage guidance counsellor, 50% social worker, 50% something else, and that's already 150%. So I think you can't train people to be good people. I think you need to recruit good staff with good hearts, with the basic qualifications needed to do the job. But I think there is something around professionalization, and you look at other comparable work with people, and I went from social housing to working in social care. And it was not only was it the same people, but like the conversations and the approach that social workers were taking. I was like, oh, I was doing this, but I had zero qualifications. So I think that there is something about not trying to, reinvent the wheel and, training an entire sector from the ground up. There's something about absolutely recognizing existing qualifications and transferables. But yeah, I think we will look back in 2043 and go, good Lord, can you imagine doing that job without having some kind of certification? As to what the model looks like, I think there'll be a bit of a bun fight on that. And who sets
not to plug the roundtables at all, despite us being on one, but this question was actually posed last summer. I think when the conversation was first kind of whispers in the wind by Emily Orman, we ran a roundtable just on qualifications, and we had about 60 people come along because it's a very, very, very contentious topic. And I think what became clear was exactly what you were saying there, Ed, which was an agreement that the sector needs professionalizing. And it is the only sector really I can think of where you work with vulnerable people and you don't need to be qualified, which is madness. But how you go about getting those qualifications, and how people going, well, I've been doing this for 20 years. What do I need to show to be qualified? Do I need to do exams? And how that all balances out is a really, really interesting one. There's a couple of points in the chat, and then I'm going to bring in Sharon. So Sarah Jackson said, I think this was on the previous point, I think there are 2 points relating to this: how to ensure providers' data is accurate and consistent in various IT systems they use, e.g. housing management, asset management, mixed with, and then part 2, the frontline operating model, and how able are frontline staff to actually know their tenants and buildings. And I think that's where the big breakdown comes. And that has to be part of a qualification. It has to be in terms of actually how you access and use data and where that comes through. Val Knight, some people in housing don't like change. Sue Weston, managing change is a huge issue and also happens to be my specialism. So I would love to speak to you, Sue. Diane Carney, I agree, Ed. I'm 100% behind qualifications in the sector. It gives a great grounding and understanding of it. And Val Knight also agrees, but mentions there, Ed, don't forget about the empathy. And I know that's what you meant by kind of the people side of it. Empathy is, if you aren't empathetic, you shouldn't be in the sector. Sharon, it's lovely to have you with us. Do please come in.
Yeah, in terms of the qualifications, I do feel sorry more for the larger housing associations. I think it is going to be interesting times for them to deal with whatever's been implemented. I'm fortunate. I work for a very small housing association. There's only 14 of us in total within the organisation. And from a housing perspective, because we can't, again, compete with some of our larger competitors in terms of salaries, we have to go in from a trainee perspective and bring people in. So we naturally, as part of the trainee role, we put them on the level 3. And then if they move up, if they progress, then we automatically expect them to do the level 4 with the Chartered Institute of Housing. Myself, how many professional qualifications I've got? You know, I've got a degree, I've got a master's, I've even got a foundation degree, I've even got my level 4, level 5 with Chartered Institute of Housing, and I've got my level 6 with Chartered Management Institute. You know, I'm fortunate. I'm one of those who actually always loved studying, so the qualification side will never be an issue. But you know, should someone really need to get all those qualifications? You know,
the balance is really, really hard. And as somebody who's, I mean, we discussed this on last week's roundtable, because I've got ADHD. I know other people that do. The thought now as an adult going back and doing qualifications and trying is, I think there's a danger of people going, no thanks, I'll leave the sector rather than do that. And
absolutely.
I don't want to do that again.
Well, let me jump in because I'm mindful of time. I'm another ADHD person. So I think that housing, social housing is an incredibly professional sector. And I think we've underplayed ourselves. So, I put a big heart on what Ed said, because this is very, very technical. We're social workers, we're counsellors, we're antisocial behaviour coordinators, we help people with their welfare benefits, we help people with all sorts of things at very important stages of their lives. So my mum's a social worker and used to teach social workers and train them. And so I've always had that kind of energy in the background. And I've looked at social care, health and social care, and been like, why don't we do that in housing? We have the same customer base. We need to employ the same level of technical ability and perhaps more, you know. So me personally, I think housing is a wonderful profession, a very professional profession. And
I think there's a need as well to give people the recognition that they are trained.
That's absolutely.
And actually, Sue Weston's just put in the chat there.
I think sorry, go on.
No, just saying Sue Weston's put in the chat there. It needs a full training needs assessment for both the role and the individual.
Yes.
To ensure training is proportionate. And actually then for some people, it will just be, go and do this day training course and we'll make sure you've got your qualification because you showcase what you need. For some, it will be you need to go all the way through. Right.
So let me just make one last point. I'm conscious of time. What I think makes people feel nervous about qualifications is that we do it in like school way. There's only, as if there's only one way to learn. So for ADHD, I can't do the classroom thing. That's not my vibe. Some people like to read, some people don't. Some people like to, you know, do formal qualification. Some people like to learn via YouTube. Some people like to learn via conversation, practical application. So it's not about the learning, it's about being too prescriptive on how you learn. So I have a level 5 qualification that doesn't meet CIH's criteria, but it's relevant. And I think actually we need to open up, we need to be a bit more inclusive about learning, because we're all individuals and we have different ways of learning and different ways of being able to kind of have those skills. And that's probably more the issue. But as housing, social housing specifically, we need to be professionally qualified to the highest level, or we need professional training and skills to be able to serve our customers best. And I
agree with you completely there.
Yeah.
If you go to a first aid course, it's about showing your practical application at the end.
Right. Yeah.
So I know we've only got 5 minutes. And
so much to talk about, people. So just last slide. Can I just
in the chat there? It seems the expectations have changed over time around professional qualifications. When she started her career, it was the expectation and desire to have qualifications. Now it's kind of changed. And Carney, experience should also be acknowledged and taken into account. And very often jobs ask for XX qualification or XX experience. And there seems to and obviously Diane's agreed there with Sarah. So I will let you move on because like I say, the qualification debate is one that can take hours. But it's certainly something that is, I think, first and foremost, a massive part of what's going on with regulation at the moment, and how that is regulated moving forward is going to be a real challenge for everybody.
Right, so I'm going to just do 2 more slides. These are the things. There's a million and one things to do, a million and one requirements, but what are the organizations that have got their head screwed on doing? They're looking at their data and their record keeping. Where are we at with our data? Do we have the systems in place? Are we able to leverage the information that we have? Yeah, that kind of what you would call a maturity assessment, which is where are we at, you know, before, and you can't run before you can walk. So having a clear understanding of where you are as an organization around your data, which underpins all decision making, is key. And then we've got something extremely exciting around asset optimization. So that's that whole life cycle piece, design of the building, use, life cycle, disposal. How are we looking at our buildings and our assets as a whole? How are we making the best use of them? How are we combining what we know about our people and our buildings and doing the best? And then finally, super key, training, learning and development, investing in your people. The staff are the most important part of any of this discussion. So we can have all sorts of fancy, whizzy things, but if the person that speaks to the resident is not up to speed, then everything falls down. And as a sector, we haven't got a head around how important in building up the capacity of our staff is, and I think that's what we need to do. So lots to do. We've got to think big, we've got to think strategically, start small, and then ramp up quickly. Go Ed, thank you. I think I've said that. Next.
Shameless plug.
Shameless. Oh, this is just the white paper. So I'd missed the first bit, and I said lots of bits about I didn't say anything. Ed said lots of bits about.
I did a spectacular job.
Did you do me justice? But if
and, you know, great.
If you've got that kind of time, I wrote a white paper, just sort of bringing together the bits around what's going on and some of my thinking. And I've got the link there. Go and check it out and fill your boots on stuff. And so yeah, thank you. 2 minutes left.
No, absolutely wonderful. Has anybody kind of got any last minute questions or points they'd like to raise? Because there's a lot that we've covered there. I think there's some really interesting ideas of what, I mean, in terms of ways to engage with the regulator, with people like yourself, Dewbien and Ed, what are you finding is working really well, and where are you finding kind of the biggest, I guess, walls of barriers to conversation?
So start the question again, so the beginning of the question.
Just from our perspective, from people in the room, evidently there's those who are really going to engage with Capita and those who you're probably hitting a bit of a brick wall with despite needing to help and wanting to help. How are you finding, what relationships are working best for you in terms of working collaboratively? How are those relationships building?
I mean, just from my side, it's appetite for change. And I think that, like I said at the beginning, Capita, we see ourselves as agents of change in the sector and helping organizations to deliver on some of those big knotty subjects like data, like process, understanding their residents better. And I think, if you think you can work in housing and come in and do the same job Monday to Friday for 30 years, sadly, you're in the wrong job. Never a dull day was my motto when I was a housing officer. I think change is a constant in housing, and I think the organizations that are going to do well and are going to really make the most out of the change in the regulatory framework are those with a strong transformational ethos, with staff that are up for it, and with leaders that are confident and believe in taking their staff forward. And I think that's the thing. You've got to be on board the change train, because over the next 20 years, we will look back and we won't recognize the sector as it is now. So I think it is about embedding change, and change is good. Let's be honest. Nobody wants to be doing the same thing day in, day out for 100 years. But I think it's about how that's managed, because we're all creatures of habit, and sometimes change is difficult, but it is good, and the end result is always worth the trials and tribulations on the way, in my humble opinion.
Well, thank you both for coming on today. Dewbien, thank you for managing to to jump back
That
on.
was a
after couple of
nightmare.
early
Thank you,
technical
everyone,
issues.
for your patience.
No, that's all great. Thank you everyone who could join us. Next week we are going back to doing one roundtable a week. I think I mentioned at the beginning, trying to do 2 of these a week is it's just proven a little bit too much. So but I'm loved it today, and the attendance has been fantastic. So thank you everybody. Next Tuesday we have Investors in Excellence joining us to talk about what actually is excellent in social housing and what to do to actually achieve excellence. So that should be great. But in the interim, Dewbien, Ed, I'm assuming the best way for people to get in touch with you is probably via LinkedIn, is it?
Yes, please do. We've got lots to say about lots of things. Also, Ed's going to be leading again the presentation. we've got a follow-up session where we're kind of talking about actual solutions. So this is all the problems and what are the issues, but there are the things that we're working on doing in different parts of the country that are extremely relevant for what we're trying to do in social housing. And that's why I've joined Capita, to kind of get in the solution space. Ed's been cracking away. So yeah, we want to come back in a couple of months' time and just talk to you guys about what you can actually practically do. So please look out for that. Look at Ed getting on.
No worries at all. Thank you.
Yeah, please, yeah, look out for
if
my next
anybody's
session.
not, I'll tag everyone in LinkedIn anyway, so you can all connect with each other. But if not, reach out, and I look forward to seeing you all at a future event. But for now, thank you everybody. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot, folks. Good to see you. All the best.